So G4S is the market leader for global services. It's renowned for providing a broad range of security solutions in an increasingly connected, complex world. It's about an £8 billion a year revenue business, but a margin of 6.5%. It's one of the top 30 suppliers, strategic suppliers to the UK government, but the UK revenues are only about 20% of the global revenues of G4S. We employ around 550,000 staff across 90 countries. And since April 2021, we've been acquired by a US business called Allied Universal. So I'm going to talk a bit about ESG. It's a subject which I'm sure many of you hear a lot about in social media. We've seen an explosion in discussion around social issues, whether that's Black Lives Matter, whether that's net zero, over the last 18 months, as it really starts resonating, not just socially with the public, but also industry. We've seen that move from B to C to B to B in the last 18 months. But who's driving it? Obviously, we've got customers. We've got supply chain transparency. We've seen the new, or Generation Z, arriving into the workplace, wanting to decide who they want to work for, not just about salary, but by the ethics of the companies that they want to work for. We've seen the rise of ESG in investment decisions. We have ESG investment funds along those lines. So what we are seeing is a pivotal moment where ESG historically has been a nice to have, becoming a must have. On top of that, we've seen a deluge in legislation. Only a few years ago, they had the UK Modern Slavery Act. We've seen dozens of new legislation around the world, all having a fundamental impact on businesses and how they operate. Again, moving from a nice to have to a critical obligation, both legally and socially. So what does that mean for a company like G4S? A business with a 6.5% margin. We don't have the luxury of a cast of thousands able to rove the world, vetting and checking suppliers and selling it. We've got to be able to operate with the constraint we've got. Because one of the things we've seen is the phrase, go woke, go broke. What that means is that although what people want to do is morally right, is it commercially viable in this environment? And how do we strike the right balance of surviving in a business whilst meeting the social obligations that our customers are starting to demand? Now, global procurement and supply chain, as I will talk to you in the coming minutes, has to play a critical part in the ESG in the supply chain. In fact, we're probably one of the best placed functions to influence and play our part. And if we look at G4S procurement, we have a diverse and globally fragmented supply chain. We have 40,000 suppliers with a global spend of around £2 billion. So that's £1 in every 4 in revenue goes straight out of the door with suppliers. But when we look at it, we have 76% of our suppliers in the UK are SMEs, which is about a third of the spend in SMEs. I have 250 procurement professionals and supply chain professionals supporting the global business, of which only 10% are based in London. The rest are scattered across 80 countries. And on top of that, we have an incredibly diverse spend. We manufacture electronics in places like Tewkesbury. We also produce workwear in India, so we have 650 staff producing the garments for us. So we have an incredibly diverse and complex supply chain and the associated risks and obligations to support that. On top of that, we're also accountable for a lot of the supply chain. So we have circa 15,000 vehicles, from the cash vehicles you'll see in the UK through to pickup trucks in Argentina. It's a very, very diverse and fascinating supply chain. So over the last few years, since I took the reins globally, I've driven 6 key pillars of transformation for procurement. Procurement has to remain relevant. And the one thing I've learned in the 2 decades of being in procurement is if you don't evolve as a procurement function, you become obsolete. We only need to look at automation. We only need to look at AI, where a lot of the basic tasks that traditionally were procurement can be automated. So what are we doing to add value in the eyes of our customers, add value in the eyes of our stakeholders? Why do they want to continue paying our salaries? What is it? What problems are we fixing? What ownership are we taking across the organization? So for me, there are the 6 key pillars that underpin that, from supporting business growth, enabling the sales force to go out and sell value, sell innovation to the customer. We need to have the oxygen to breathe of cost and value in our supply chain. That's a given. But at the end of the day, it's ESG that has crept up behind us over the last few years, where we can really make a fundamental difference with what our value proposition is all about. So when we talk about ESG, it means a lot of things to a lot of people. It means a lot of things to every industry. So for us, the first part was to say, okay, what actually should we be trying to understand is ESG? And it can be social, it can be environmental, governance, compliance, but also transparency in the supply chain. So a complex global security business demands a supply chain which satisfies the company's ESG obligations, as this can provide great comfort to a progressive customer or socially responsible investor, and thus becoming a competitive advantage. So in a low-margin business, a lot of this sounds, well, it's obvious, isn't it? But when I started back in G4S 5-6 years ago, and I sat down with some of the senior leaders, and I talked about ESG, I got the so what question. The question that resonates with me today is, what is adequate? I.e., what is the bare minimum that we need to do? We've got many other things in our business, and therefore, what is it? And if you looked at back in 5-6 years ago, the Modern Slavery Act in the UK, well, it was a modern slavery policy. So the view was, well, all you need to do is just confirm that you're compliant and issue online a statement. Well, we all know that's never enough. That wasn't good enough. So the key part for procurement was to say, okay, sorry, that doesn't work. If you don't anticipate what is going to happen in the next couple of years, you'll be left behind. And what we're seeing is that if you're not ready, the bids, the way the tender processes are run, we will lose business. Yeah. Well, plenty of rain today. So what I thought was, okay, at G4S, what are the 6 key things? We need to understand the problem. We need to prioritize. We cannot boil the ocean. We also need deliverable and credible targets. It's a marathon, not a sprint. If we become first in class, best in class, if we align with the FMCG, that would require an investment that our business simply couldn't afford at this moment. So we need to strike the right balance of affordability and the delivery that is demanded and expected from us. We also need to get the internal business on the journey. Our internal stakeholders have a lot on their plate. We're a very lean organization. So when procurement starts knocking on the door saying, I'm expecting you to do this, you've got to find a reason why it's relevant to them. What problem of theirs are we fixing? And finally, for me, it's action and monitoring. What tangible deliveries are we doing, and how are we monitoring that progress? So this is the dreaded Scope 3. Up until a couple of years ago, most people would have gone, not really sure what it is. I didn't know what it was. But when we look at our mapping of our footprint, which companies have done in the UK for decades, they were great at measuring, well, what's the carbon footprint of our fleet? How much CO2 do we emit from our buildings? On the whole, most companies had a good handle. They had a good vision that we wanted to decrease our carbon footprint 5% year on year. And on the whole, everybody was happy. But then suddenly, net zero came along. The government, UK government, wants net zero by 2050, a bold and ambitious statement and a great vision from which we should all strive to. But the elephant in the room comes in and says, right, what actually is net zero? And when we need to understand Scope 3, what is the size of that? And I'll come on to that in a minute about how we've measured it. but it certainly produced a lot of stunned silence in the meetings when people thought, that's a challenge. So moving on to prioritization, at G4S we thought, well, okay, all of those ESG obligations are valid, but we've got to make sure that we go for the ones that we can really add value over the next 2-3 years. It might mean after that we can continue to expand what we do, and we always need to acknowledge that this is an evolving challenge. This is not a line that we reach and then we finished. The goalpost will continually move as customers and as general perception about net zero and social value increases. So what we wanted to focus on, carbon footprint, health and safety, human rights and labor, diversity, supply chain transparency, have all started to underpin what we wanted to do. Now I'm going to go back to scope 3 here. We've completed the mapping. And when this was presented to me, I suddenly thought, wow, our carbon footprint has grown by 8-fold. 84% of our carbon footprint is now in scope 3. And we also need to remember, where does scope 3 sit? It sits in our supply chain. Who is best equipped to help that? Procurement. Now, our carbon footprint naturally isn't at that high. We're only looking at about 170,000 tons. Now, you look at Apple's carbon footprint, that's 25 million tons. 74% of Apple's carbon footprint sits in scope 3. So we are a fraction of a percent, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be playing our part. But what it says is that the problem is sitting in the supply chain, and procurement need to be pivotal in how we address that. So what do? Do we write to suppliers and tell them they've got to cut their footprint? Do we bake it into the tender process? Well, one thing I can say is we are starting to see not just the public sector, we're starting to see the private sector add a robust aspect of their RFPs. We have a £40 million tender at the moment, which 30% is sustainability and ESG related. So we now have the sales team running up to us saying, it's not just about price. What are you doing about net zero? So it's critical that we are able to provide answers, because in a business like us, we can win and lose contracts on a 1% price differential, especially in our FM business. So it's critical that we don't disadvantage the organization, but at the same time, we don't make promises that we simply can't keep. So one of the things that I've been pushing forward is, let's use technology. Let's use some of the fantastic tools that are out there. But I have a word of warning. There are a lot of companies out there and a lot of tools that will promise you the earth. They will turn your lead into gold. But when you actually scrape beneath the surface, 90% of the work sits with your team. And you've got a nice veneer on top, and you pay tens, if not hundreds of thousands of pounds for that. So what was critical is to find a range of partners who can actually deliver the value that we need in our supply chain, that can empower the buyers without drowning them with actions and activities. So I'm just going to talk about some of the 6 partners that we've signed up to that hasn't cost us the earth. In fact, some have been fantastic value for the impact that we've been able to deliver. And it's only been in the last 2 years that we've really kicked off these programs. And the majority of these are small SMEs who've got a fantastic value proposition, but behind it, they've got the infrastructure to actually deliver and not just pass the problem back to us. We've signed up with Safe Contractor because I feel strongly that any company that goes on site in our organization, or indeed a client's location, is not just screened at the point of contract, but continuously vetted and screened for the certification. If you've got an electrician going in and they're not certified, if something goes wrong, where does the reputational damage sit? It sits with us, not our subcontractors. So it's important that we have ongoing screening, that we can use and empower companies to provide that capability. We've also very recently partnered with an organization called Integrity Next, which again, I'll go into a bit more detail after this. But what it does is it gives us a global reach, not just a UK, not just a developed world focus, but operating in countries where the infrastructure and sometimes the business ethics is a generation behind Europe and North America. EcoVadis, you all know them. They're highly respected, highly well known, and provide us with that capability of understanding and rating our suppliers. Not just providing data, not just digesting it and telling us that we need to interpret it. They give us an answer. Corporate Citizenship is an organization that, let's be honest, is giving us the handrail as we drive towards net zero. We as a business, the first question was, can we do that in-house? Can our own teams do it? Well, yes, we could probably try, but we might get it wrong. And therefore, we could end up going down a rabbit hole and lose a year or two to become competitive and aligned with what our competitors are doing. Credit Safe, they provide global financial data, not just to Dun & Bradstreet, not just the information in your G7 countries, but if I want to go to Uganda, if I want to go to Côte d'Ivoire, and I want to understand the financial risks, I need to understand that because that's where the risk in the supply chain sits. It doesn't sit in many of the countries where some of the more developed tools are. And finally, EC Manage. We wonder what they are. We employ 500,000 staff. The vast majority wear workwear, uniform. The opportunity for huge amounts of waste is there. So we need the ability to track our garments, our uniforms, so we can dispose of them, we can recycle them, but we can also optimize the usage. And again, it's not just about carbon footprint, it's also about waste management and all the other aspects. So zooming in onto 3 key areas that we have felt is important, or I've felt is important in our ESG agenda. With Integrity Next, our goal is that all suppliers, we will have captured globally a baseline set of data. We're not just talking about the UK, we're talking about 23 countries in Africa, a dozen countries across LATAM, where we're able to have a clear understanding of the makeup of those companies, the diversity. I can remember the CEO in the UK a few years ago coming out of a meeting with one of the UK government departments who said, SMEs, we must have more SMEs. But as I turned around and said, stop, do we have a problem? Well, we don't know. So we could have spent a lot of time promoting the use of SMEs when actually we needed to understand, well, how many SMEs do we have? And as I mentioned earlier, 76% of our suppliers are SMEs. So do we need to invest huge amounts of time promoting the use of SMEs when we already do? So what is important is we understand the problem before we try and fix it. And that is going to be done through supply chain transparency. On top of this, Integrity Next track suppliers using social media. So if there is an unethical supplier that is being talked about anywhere around the world with 1 million pieces of data every day, that is then digested, correlated, and then the buyer is informed. So we can then, with far greater proactivity, anticipate the problem and potentially fix it. Because G4S is a magnet for news. Good or bad, I'll let you decide. People don't care about the subcontractors. That's not important. It's G4S. If you're a Guardian journalist and the word G4S is mentioned, you've got a story. So it's absolutely essential that we take that ownership to make sure our suppliers meet the standards that are expected of us. On top of that, we've got EcoVadis. We rolled this program out a couple of years ago. And what we have is a triple-layered approach to modern slavery. All suppliers must sign our terms of code of conduct. All suppliers within high-risk categories above a certain spend threshold must be screened by EcoVadis. They must meet a standard of 40 points or more. If not, they must come up with a remedial plan or we replace them. And at the moment, 1 in 20 suppliers has been replaced. So it must have teeth to be credible. And then finally, where we have far higher risk suppliers, we then will bring in Hill Associates, which is a subsidiary of G4S, to go on site to do proper screening, which we used during the pandemic when we wanted to make sure that we had sources of PPE and we had access to that and we weren't just basically being sold faulty or the wrong product. And finally, corporate citizenship. We are being helped to our net zero. We've made the commitment to net zero with the Cabinet Office. We've mapped our scopes 1, 2, and 3. We are in the process of agreeing a science-based target. Now, that's the critical point that I think we are on the front foot. We are signing up to a science-based target. It gives us credibility with the statement we make, but it also puts obligations on us. We're accelerating the rollout of the EV fleet across the UK and Europe. We've got a program to move to 100% renewable energy. The word of caution. Now is not the time to, if you fixed in your energy cost, you hedge your energy cost, to suddenly move out of that. The energy market, as you've clearly seen, is highly volatile. On top of that, sustainable gas sources are 30% more expensive than your traditional gas source. So you need to understand the economics, you need to understand the consumption in order to steer through that without making a statement that can be financially damaging to the business. We've also recently published our PPN 0621, which is obviously the government-required template for carbon reduction. So that should be on our website by the end of this month. And then finally, within the procurement, we are now driving a much more enhanced process in the weighting and the selection of sustainability. The UK government, between 10 and 20% of a lot of its tenders will be social value. We've seen that with some of the private sector bids. If we are to get to net zero, we've got to start that journey as well to start reducing our scope 3. So the other bit is, how do we keep the business aligned to what we're doing? How do we make sure that we continue with this? So what we've got is we've signed up with Power BI. We pay a few £100. We've got a fantastic team, small team, who can then take the data, process it, and publish it. So what this does is it empowers the meetings we have with the business. It empowers the meetings we have with the customers. We can give them semi-real-time information at the fraction of the cost of some of those tools out there that can then say, what's relevant to your business? What about the supplier? We can have an improved conversation and improved engagement with the organization. And we've got to bear in mind, it's all about credibility in the eyes of the customer. Do they believe what we're saying? Do they actually really think that we have the tools and the sincerity to deliver what we're going to say? And in summary, what have we got? We've got a clear program. We're not boiling the ocean. We simply can't. But we also acknowledge that this is just the start. How much does it cost us? At the moment, it's 0.001% of our supplier annual spend. Now, it'll probably go up a bit, but it is not expensive if you use the right tools, you deploy your resource and your approach in an intelligent manner. We've chosen partners who can actively drive the projects using technology, but an important requirement for us given the limited resources that we have in our procurement function. There are also supplier, co-funded or business-funded options. So you can look at the scenario of how you want to fund this, because that will underpin a lot of what you do. It doesn't make it easier if you have supplier part funded, but it does mean that you can then potentially be more ambitious. And then finally, you need the top-down management in certain countries which have a larger risk profile. Procurement on its own will not succeed. We need to be partnering with the business. They need to be on the same page as much as we with them. We also need to be prepared that the goalposts are going to move. We've seen aggressive delivery by competitors. We're seeing some of our competitors signing up to net zero by 2035. We've seen some saying scope 1, 2, all sorted within the next 5 years. Can we match that? Can we beat that? Or have they actually signed up to something that they're just not going to be able to deliver? And finally, what we will be seeing as a global business like G4S, at the moment it's very much tailored towards global businesses and the UK, the US. But I can guarantee that in the months, in the years, these clients are going to say, well, that's all good and well. What's your global net zero? And that is a real challenge. But we need to make sure that we've got the infrastructure in place that we can then be ready to be seen as though we're, if only one step ahead, that we are ahead of the curve. Any questions?
Thank you, Robert. Is my microphone working? Yes, it is. Excellent. First of all, congratulations for persevering through the microphone and through the heavens opening as well.
Thank you.
Just when you were talking about climate change as well. So really appropriate.
All on cue.
Oh, absolutely. Friends in high places, clearly, Robert. Okay, so some questions. We'll just dive straight into these. Do we need more innovation in procurement, and where should that come from? The SMEs or giants like G4S? And then you did mention, I mean, quite a high stat. Was it like 73% of your suppliers were?
76%.
76%. So do we need more innovation, and where does it need to come from?
Well, the answer is yes. SMEs are a fantastic incubator of innovation. They're agile, they're creative, often sometimes maybe lacking funding, but a majority of companies that we've signed up with, they're SMEs. They're also far more willing to work with us, far more willing to adapt and modify the systems and the tools that become relevant to us. Where we all know trying to negotiate a software license with Microsoft, forget it. The rule is Microsoft have more lawyers than software engineers or something, whether that's true or not. So often the SMEs can give you that agility, that passion to find solutions to problems. Companies like G4S, we need to promote that. We need to listen and get out there and find out what, because we can make the investments that the SMEs need to turn that innovation into reality.
Okay, and I'm going to go to the bottom on there as well. So what's your top tip, so just one, for encouraging a positive culture shift towards net zero?
Know your audience. It's about internal change. Procurement, ironically, we are salesmen. We're selling change. If we are to deliver the change that we need, we've got to be able to influence internally. And therefore, know your audience, know your stakeholders, understand what problems they've got, make what you want to drive as a change relevant to them. And you've got to be subtle, you've got to do your homework, but if you can go in and connect what you want to change with what they need, you will go 10 times further and 10 times faster.
Okay, do we have any questions from the floor, by the way? Yes, we do. Could we just get a microphone over to this gentleman? And if you just start by stating your name and where you're from, please. Thank you.
Good morning. Mark Masterson here from Tilbrook. Firstly, congratulations on the journey so far, and I loved you stating that it was a marathon rather than a sprint. It's slightly related to the innovation question. How do you ensure, with the programs that you're putting in place, that you can source new suppliers in the greater, wider world that will comply and be ready for the standards that you're setting?
That's a really good question. I mean, I was sitting down with the CEO of the European business, and the acknowledgement that by baking in ESG into the tender process, mean we could end up appointing more expensive suppliers. So there is the awareness in the organization that this ESG might not come for free, and that once the business has to accept and acknowledge that of the importance of what needs to be done, I think the business will also be more open to changing suppliers that help meet this, with the acknowledgement that there could be a small cost associated with that.
Okay, just time for one more. And again, going back to your presentation there, I mean, an incredible stat, really. You talked about the cost and the incredibly low cost, really, that you're achieving, which is 0.001%, was it?
Yep.
And so how is tech helping you find the right balance between cost and sustainability?
Well, that's a journey that we've just started to undertake. And at the moment, we don't yet know. We will certainly find out in 2021 as some of our larger tenders have these obligations, have the criteria that boost ESG. So at the moment, I can't answer that. But if you ask me this time next year, we might start to see what that impact is.
Okay, thank you, Robert. Well, we'll ask you that question next year, live on stage. So for now, thank you, Robert.
Thank you.
I'll just take the clicker. Thank you.